join me in welcoming Manny Waks and Michael Visontay.
All right, well look, I think we probably need a little while to digest the gravity and authority of what David has said, but thank you very much for a tremendous launching speech. I'd like to welcome everybody here to the Melbourne launch of Manny's book. Before we go into a conversation which takes us through the trajectory of Manny's life and experiences in an abridged form, of course, I'd just like to throw to Manny, who has a few words that he'd like to say to people who've come tonight.
Thank you, Michael. I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for coming. Welcome, thank you to Readings. Of course, thank you to Michael, my co-author. David, of course, for that entertaining and kind introduction. I hope, I'm happy to answer anything at the end. Of course, I'm more than open to anything that you feel you'd like to ask, Michael.
All right. So, what we're going to do now is have a short conversation on three main areas, really. One is how Manny's experiences as an abuse victim have shaped his life, and also the effect of that within the context of being raised in a Chabad environment. The second thing is the impact of Manny's advocacy on the Jewish community and the leadership, and the third, the impact of his advocacy on himself and his family, the personal toll that it has exacted. So many of you would know Manny's story, so we're not going to go into some of the things that David has alluded to in too much detail. He's one of 17 children who was raised in a very devoted Chabad environment, family. And when he was an adolescent, he was sexually abused on several occasions by two people, which many of you will know about as well. The impact of that has obviously been profound because it's got us to this point, but I'd like to ask you, Manny, take us back to the times after that and just how that's affected you in ways that people may not have realised, the way in which you expressed your rebellion, the way that you went off a course that you were on into a different path that has just meandered in all these different directions to get us up to today.
So we're talking about, of course, in the late 80s when, in my early teenage years, just before the bar mitzvah, which is a very important milestone in the Jewish calendar life cycle. And certainly for the Chabad world, in the Chabad world, many of the community members, when you're about to turn bar mitzvah, it's one of the most exciting times. You're about to get your suit and your hat, and you're starting to wear phylacteries, tefillin. You can be part of a minyan, one of 10 males to pray in the synagogue. So many very positive and interesting things to look forward to with added responsibility. You can lead prayers. And instead of enjoying that lead-up process, I remember obviously at the age of 11, before the abuse happened, I was very excited about it. But by the time the studies and the period before the actual bar mitzvah commences at the age of 12, that's when I'd already been abused multiple times inside the synagogue. The mikvah came later on, but on the yeshiva grounds, on Elwood synagogue grounds, it happened many times by two different people associated with the yeshiva centre. So my interaction and my view of religion and religiosity and the Jewish leaders, the rabbis in particular, certainly wasn't up there. And certainly I recall rebelling against that world. And when you say rebelling in the secular world, often we're talking about someone going off drugs and doing all sorts of wild things. But in my case, it was more about putting on a pair of jeans or putting on a pair of shorts, and occasionally turning the lights on and off, or not wearing a yarmulke. So on the Shabbat, turning the lights on, desecrating Shabbat, eating not kosher food. so it's all relative, I guess. But for me, it was obviously a very isolating and lonely world because essentially there aren't many people around you living in that kind of environment. So it certainly did shake my world to the very core, which of course then had ramifications both in the home and at school and anywhere else really, looking for attention, trying to push the boundaries, getting into trouble all the time.
Mm. So you were a feisty boy even before you had these experiences, and I guess the sort of greatest expression of the rebellion and the difficulties was that you decided pretty much off your own bat when you were a teenager that you were going to leave Melbourne, you were going to leave the family home, and you were going to go off to Israel, not in the usual way that Chabad boys do it, but you were going off to join the Israeli army, and make Aliyah, become a citizen of Israel. Tell us a little bit about that, because again, that was an adventure in many senses.
I finished secular education at the age of 12, so from that time till the age of 18, and I went to Israel in '94, I'd been studying religious studies the whole time, even though my level of religiosity wasn't necessarily particularly high. But finally, when the decision did come, it was really an uplifting and a really gave me a sense of freedom when I did take off to Israel. It was the first time I was leaving my community, my country, and all alone in the world. And it was just an anecdote where I write in the book that when I did go on that plane, I took a razor with me onto the aeroplane, and those, I guess, in the days that you could take a razor. And then the first thing I did after takeoff was go to the bathroom and just shave those little hairs that I had all over myself. And of course, I didn't know that you needed shaving cream, so I did come out with a whole lot of red blood and scratches all over my face, which was a bit uncomfortable and strange. So, but that was really, for me, it was freedom for the first time, and it was also going into an unknown world because, you know, all I had ever known was the religious framework, and suddenly I'm going to Israel, which obviously the Jewish state, but it has everything in there, a big melting pot. So it was very nice, and certainly going to my family in Israel until then, also some issues arose because ultimately, as nice as my late grandfather was in saying, come over to my place, I'll be more lenient, it didn't quite turn out that way because he wanted me to go to synagogue on the Sabbath morning while I was trying to recover from Friday night going out. And we obviously often ran into each other. It didn't quite work out, so eventually I was kicked out of there as well after I'd already experienced getting kicked out of my parents' home at the age of 15 for being secular. So I guess I was very fortunate the fact that I came back for my sister's wedding in '96 and heard the radio advertisement about if you know anything about the issue of child sexual abuse, any allegations, come forward to the police. And that's when I guess for the first time ever, I considered going to the police.
Mm. So this was obviously a very significant moment because you were taking something that had been internalised within you and family to an extent outside, and you were doing the right thing. Tell us exactly why it didn't go anywhere, because I think that's very important. David's alluded to it, and really it's quite central to your story. If the police had done something at the time, we may not be sitting here.
The police couldn't speak to my first perpetrator, Velvel Sorobransky, who's living out in New York, because he'd already moved there in the early 90s. And with David Cyprus, they went and they interviewed him, and of course he denied everything. And they came back to me, it's your word against his word, we're not going to shut the case, we'll leave it open pending further information. So that was obviously devastating for me. But then also, when I bumped into Rabbi Groner, the late Rabbi Groner, the former head of the Yeshiva Center for decades, he lived around the corner from us in between Yeshiva. And when I bumped into him, I approached him about it, and he said to me, I basically didn't have to finish my sentence because it was very clear he knew what was going on, and he said to me that no need for you to deal with it, we're on top of it, we're aware of the allegations and we're addressing it, so no need for you to take it any further. So from my perspective as a 20-year-old kid, you know, I obviously hadn't gotten over that experience of abuse. I was in Israel, sure, I was in the army, it'd been already 5-6 years from the last abuse, but it never went away. I was obviously very angry, very upset, at the same time walking past the yeshiva centre and still seeing, this is something I still don't understand to this day, with all the allegations that they were aware of, David Tsipras not only was allowed to remain in the community, but he was still all the time in the front of the centre, in charge of security, despite the allegations they knew about for about a decade. So, to say times were different, you can say all sorts of things, perhaps mitigating factors, but how someone who came to have those allegations, so many as it became clear in the Royal Commission, about in relation to around 5 victims throughout the 80s that were aware. And this is 96 when I went to the police, and David Tsipras is still in charge of security. How, I still don't understand. So obviously seeing David Tsipras in front there all the time, often smirking at me, looking at me, obviously ensured that the scars were always to remain or exacerbated.
We'll come to the moment we went to the age and started snowballing all of this, but before that, I'd just like to sort of set a scene for people. You've gone to the Israeli army, a boy who had trouble with authority, went to probably the most disciplined fighting force in the world, and of course you had more problems there. You came back here, you went to the police, they gave you nothing. And then you faced a moment that not that many boys who've been brought up in Chabad have to face, and that is, I'm outside of the Chabad firmament, intellectually and emotionally I'm moving away from it. What am I going to do? And, you know, to be frank, as you said to me quite often, you weren't that well equipped to make your way in the secular world. Your education from the age of 12, 13 had been